In last week's episode we looked at how Camus was saying to rebel one needs to live totally freely, and that is achieved by living always at all times for one's own pleasure, even though that may at times put oneself outside the law, and even though it may at times even require one to commit murder, and at the same time someone else who is living by the same principles might feel obliged to murder oneself, and so then it becomes a struggle to see who is the stronger, so it becomes almost living in a cowboy film. But that is necessary, he says, to rebel against this unjust situation that we're living in. So now he goes on to talk about another reason for rebelling, and this is again quoting the example of Ivan Karamazov from the Dostoevsky novel, who can't endure the contemplation of a child's suffering. Just to see a child's tears is something that he can't bear. And so again he blames God for that God permits that to happen. How can he allow a child to suffer and still be God? And so Ivan then comes to the conclusion that he has to rebel against God. And that's something I think a lot of people have probably thought at times. I mean, if God is all-powerful and if God is good, why is there evil in the world? Why is there pain and injustice and suffering, and why are children suffering? So Camus thinks that. Ivan apparently thinks that. I think probably most people have thought that at some time in their life. And again, it comes to a question of blaming God for it. God has set the situation up, and he hasn't done it properly, either through malice or just through carelessness, but he's allowed this to happen. And both Camus and Ivan quote Jesus himself, who says that one needs to accept that there is injustice and suffering. I mean, he talks about turning the other cheek, and we referenced a few weeks ago, we mentioned some of Paul's letters in which he talks about remaining in whatever situation one finds oneself in life without complaining about it. It doesn't really matter all that much. So it seems as though God, the Father, Jesus, the Son, are both saying, well, you just have to accept this suffering and pain and evil. That's what Ivan Karamazov thinks, that's what Camus thinks, and that's what a lot of people think. So it's this perennial problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world, in God's world? And we could spend a whole episode or several episodes in this series looking at that, but it's a huge question. I think ultimately it just comes down to the question of free will. God made us humans with free will. He wants us to have free will. He wants us to make our choices. He wants us to come to him, obey him, live with him, be in fellowship with him, but he's not going to force us. He wants us to make that decision. So that's probably really all I can say about that at the moment. I mean, we're talking about Camus, but that other big issue, we can talk about that at length later perhaps. But certainly it's a big issue for Camus, and apparently for Ivan Karamazov. And I think Camus would think that Dostoevsky held that same view. But as I mentioned in last week's episode, I think he's wrong in that. Dostoevsky puts forward the character of Ivan Karamazov with his ideas. He also puts forward in the same book Alyosha, who's this very Christ-like character, and in several of others of his novels he has similar characters. So I think Dostoevsky is just saying, well, there are people in the world who have these ideas. I'm showing you how they're thinking, and I'm showing you people that think in other ways, and just presenting them as case studies in a way, somewhat reserving his own views, although they do come out. But I think they're very different from Camus' views. So Ivan Karamazov almost because of his compassion, comes to feel that he has to rebel against God. And it's odd in a way that Camus, having used the Marquis de Sade as almost a role model for this metaphysical rebellion, should then put alongside him someone who's so concerned about the suffering of children. But anyway, Ivan decides that he has to reject God. He actually goes over to the devil's side and ends up in a state of kind of madness. So then Camus talks about other examples of these what he calls metaphysical rebels. And we mentioned last week Byron and Shelley's heroes, Prometheus and people like that, who is in a state of rebellion against the gods. A couple of hundred years before that, Milton wrote his poem Paradise Lost. And I've heard many people talking about, they talk about the character of Satan in that, and putting him forward as a prototype romantic rebel, almost like in the Byronic mould, and they're suggesting that he is kind of the hero of the whole poem of Paradise Lost. I think there's probably some truth to that, but then Satan, the first two books, or first two parts of Paradise Lost concern Satan, how he struggles to break free from his bondage in hell, to somehow escape from hell, get to earth and do what he's going to do in the world of human beings and try to re-establish his own dominion in some way in defiance and rebellion against God. That's only the first two books. The whole poem is 12 books, so that's only quite a small part of it. I think probably most people who read Paradise Lost, if any do, I mean, most people who do read it, I think probably only read the first one or two books, so that's really the only part they come in contact with. But even so, the character of Satan does play the major part in those two books. But even there, I think Milton's attitude towards him is very different from that of Byron and Shelley towards their heroes. He's certainly not a supporter or an admirer of Satan's role. But there are many, through literature, particularly in the last couple of centuries, there have been a number of these rebels, and it becomes increasingly apparent, I think, as Camus talks about this, that although he says that he's rebelling against this idea, this concept of the absurd, that actually he's really protesting against God. He doesn't say it outright, but there are many things that show that that's what he's really talking about. So now he goes on to talk about Nietzsche, of course, the late 19th century German philosopher. And I suppose Nietzsche is probably most famous for his book Thus Spake Zarathustra and the famous statement in that God is dead. But through that book and through others, he talks about a situation for human beings where man is alone. There is nothing above him, there's nothing below him, there's no master, there is no God, there's nothing that can dictate to us or control us. And he actually says there is no good and evil. There is just man in existing. It may be an intolerable situation as Camus sees it, but then Nietzsche seems to say, well, it's a situation with opportunities. If man exists by himself in this universe, he can do whatever he chooses. So there's no arbitrary decision about what is good or what is bad. He just does what he wants to do. And earlier in Camus' book, the statement came, when he was talking about Ivan Karamazov, the statement came up, if nothing is true, then everything is permitted. That's right. If nothing is true, everything is permitted. So that would certainly be true in the case of someone like Meursault in The Outsider. And probably Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. There's no values, there's no truth, there's no ultimate good or bad, so I can do whatever I like. That's what he's saying. But then Nietzsche says something which is a bit odd. He says, if nothing is true, nothing is permitted. So he seems to be contradicting that. I'm not quite sure what he means, but so if nothing is true, everything is permitted. You can do whatever you like. There's no morality, yes. But if nothing is true, nothing is permitted. I'm just not sure what he means. Perhaps he's saying that we are completely adrift in this universe without any values or meaning. So we can't do anything really, but we will do anything we like. So it's a total rebellion, even against that nothingness. We even rebel against that. So we're not only rebelling against God, but we're rebelling even against that kind of negation. Nothing is permitted, but I'm just going to do it anyway. I think that's probably what he's getting at. So Nietzsche was talking about the human will, just doing what you like, doing what you want. We talked last week about, what's his name? Just the sorcerer guy that said, do whatever thou wilt. Anyway, so the same idea there. He advocated having strong dictatorial leaders. And of course, a lot of people have said that Hitler and the Nazis took a lot of their ideas from Nietzsche and actually put them into practice, that established that there was a strong tyrannical leader who completely dominated others by his will, and they decided to do whatever they liked. Nietzsche also was very contemptuous of Christianity as a religion of weaklings and of the Jews, that he just regarded as kind of disgusting and needed to be obliterated. So it's not hard to see why people would think that the Nazis took a lot of their thinking from Nietzsche. But the world of philosophy strongly rejects that idea, and Camus does as well. They don't really want to think that one of their philosophical heroes should be associated with Hitler and the Nazis. So I've heard it said many times to say that it's a terrible mistake to think that Nietzschean philosophy was taken up by the Nazis, that somehow they just totally misrepresented it and didn't understand it and applied it in an incorrect way. And so they want to absolve Nietzsche for any blame for Nazism. And that's Camus' position, but I think it's a very weak position, because one only has to read a bit of Nietzsche to see that most of his ideas that I've just mentioned were the very same ideas that Hitler and the Nazis put into practice. So then he goes on to talk about Hegel, who was another German philosopher earlier in the 19th century, who in turn was an influence on Nietzsche and other people.